Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Anil Gupta, who's Professor of Philosophy, Professor of History, and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh, and a Fellow of the Center for Philosophy of Science and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is also editor of Philosophy and Phenomenological Research. Welcome, Anil.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to your podcast, Gil.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your papers from 2018 entitled Outline of an Account of Experience. And before we start, Anil, I have to tell you that I have been spoiled by engineering, life sciences, and economics. And so the topic of discussion for us today is I'm almost a blank slate for that. So you have to sort of direct me to talk about this because I have really no knowledge of this area. But I'm fascinated by it, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So in this paper, you say, the account of experience sketched below is one to which I was led by a reflection of empirical thinking, and more specifically on empirical reasoning and empirical dialectic. Sometimes when we reason, you say, for example, when we are proving an arithmetical claim, our reasoning is independent of the experiences we undergo as we reason. The contents of our claims, as well as the legitimacy of our inferential moves, including the introduction of new terms through definitions, do not depend on our concurrent experiences. They do not depend on things we happen to be seeing, hearing, touching, or tasting, or smelling as we reason. But you say at other times, this is not so. Our reasonings at these times do depend on experiences as we undergo, as we reason. Now, these other times you mention, Anil, are they few, or are they quite a frequent times that we get into situations that we are reasoning with experience?
Well, say when we're doing mathematics,
yeah,
and we are establishing a mathematical result, we are reasoning there.
Yeah,
and the reasoning that we engage in there does not depend upon the what we are smelling or touching. Right, we can reason with our senses, closed, or say, you have a theory, say Newtonian theory, and you're using that to figure out the trajectory of some object. You're reasoning, so you're reasoning from Newtonian principles, and you're arriving at a conclusion. That reasoning does not depend on the experiences you're having when you're reasoning, right? So there are two kinds of reasonings. One kind is where you begin with some principles and ideas, say mathematical axioms or physical axioms, and you reason from them, you deduce from them various consequences. That's one kind of reasoning, right?
Yeah.
That kind of reasoning doesn't depend on what you're experiencing when you are reasoning. You can reason with your eyes closed. You can do that kind of reasoning with your eyes closed. But there's another kind of reasoning, which is much harder. I mean, there's this first kind of reasoning, from going from principles to conclusions, that is very well understood, thanks to the work of the logicians in the 19th and early 20th century. So, Frege, Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, Kurt Gödel, Alan Turing, these people really made very clear how this reasoning proceeds. And this reasoning is so clear that you can automate it.
Right. You can delegate that to computers.
That's right.
Now.
They can calculate. They can reason. That kind of reasoning can be done by a computer because it's so well understood. It's so precise. But there's another kind of reasoning, and this is the reasoning not from principles, but to the principles. So how do we reason to Newtonian principles, for example, or a chemical principle? That reasoning depends on experience. We see something and we make a perceptual judgment, or we observe something, right? And we reason then somehow to those principles. So there's reasoning to the principles, and there is reasoning from the principles. Reasoning to the principles depends on experience. And actually, when ordinary kind of reasoning also that we do depend on experiences. So, I gave the example of, I want to figure out how much paint is needed to paint my living room. That depends on my current my experiences. I go and measure the room, right? So there is reasoning two principles, which depends on experiences. But it's also,
so there are two types. So if I understand this correctly, I know. So the experiences one has, the accumulated experiences from the past, it sort of shapes your reasoning process, right? And so if that is true, then how one reasons in the second variety, reasoning to the principles, that reasoning processes could be different for different people?
Yes, they could be different. And that is actually a bit of a puzzle. I mean, that reasoning, as you say, depends on what your past experiences have been, or what your view is, right? What perceptual judgments you make depends on how you take the world to be. It doesn't seem to be independent of how you take the world to be. But if your perceptual judgments depend on how you take the world to be, then how does your view of the world gain any authority? I mean, you could have a crazy view, right? You could have a conspiracy theory view, and you make your that influences your judgments. So but there's something wrong with that kind of reasoning. So there's a puzzle, our perceptual judgments depend on our views, on our past experiences, as you put it. But on the other hand, the reasonableness of our view depends on the perceptual judgments. So I mean, so how do you break out of this thing? So there's a huge problem understanding empirical reasoning. And incidentally, one response to this problem has been to try to isolate special kinds of judgments which don't depend on your view or your past experiences, which just depend on your current experiences. So, for example, you might look at um, a green ball, right? And instead of
Yeah.
making the judgment that that's a green ball, you simply make the judgment, I am now having an experience of something green.
Mm.
Um, that judgment, it seems, is independent of what you take the world to be. Well, that's independent of your past experiences. So one approach to the whole problem has been, and it's kind of it has a long history.
Yeah.
And this is one way of thinking about reasoning and experience. That experience provides you with certain fundamental judgments and certain fundamental
Right.
concepts which don't depend on your antecedent view or on your past
So
experiences.
yeah, and so you mentioned reasonableness of reasoning. So the reasonableness of one's reasoning is localized, right? It can only have value in that the person who is reasoning in that frame, uh, everyone else could not. I shouldn't say could not, but presumably may not have the same level of reasonableness to that reasoning. I would imagine because they all have different frameworks, right?
Right. But I mean, there is a notion of rightness that
Hmm.
can still be recovered. Um, that is, I mean, say with the first kind of reasoning that I mentioned, where you're reasoning from principles, right?
Yeah.
Starting from different principles, you'll deduce different things. But nonetheless, there's a general notion of logically valid argument, which
Hmm.
holds across principles. Doesn't matter what principles you're beginning with, right? Um, and deductive logic sort of lays down what those rules are of proper reasoning.
Hmm.
Similarly, it would seem that with empirical reasoning that depends on experience, there is something about rightness. um,
Hmm.
but how to explain the rightness? That's not easy, right? Um,
Right.
so, for example, we all take to think that the Earth is round. That's the reasonable thing to think, given what we've experienced, right? Um, the other view is crazy. That's that's flat Earth view, right? But exactly what is
Right.
it? How is it that the round Earth view is the reasonable one, and the flat Earth view
Hmm.
is the unreasonable one? Or why is it that the QAnon view is unreasonable, and a kind of a common sense view is reasonable?
Hmm.
um, that's not easy to say. That's not easy to say. Um,
Right.
as I was saying, this idea that experience provides you with some special judgments that that led to problems. You can't understand rationality in terms of that. You can't understand reasonableness in terms of that. And so, in the paper that you
Yeah.
mentioned, I make a proposal about how to think about these things.
Hmm. Yeah. I want to get your insight on something related, but not in your paper. So I sometimes think about experiences, and I'm thinking about the business world now. Experiences as biases. And one of my books from 2009 called Flexibility, I argue that the way that companies are constructed, sort of like a pyramidal fashion, the people who get promoted are those with more experience. That structure is doomed to fail because experience, by definition, is a set of biases. And when the company is required to innovate, experience actually acts as a noise on innovation. I don't know if you agree with that notion, or I just want to get your perspective on that.
Well, I think we need to distinguish
Yeah,
two senses of experience. Um,
yeah,
there is one sense of experience which is what you've gone through, your history, right? one might have spent a decade repairing sewing machines, right? And so one is experienced in that. That's one sense of experience. The other sense of experience is suppose you're looking at something, you're looking out of the window, and you see a bird fly by, right? There's a visual experience you undergo then, right? That lasts for a short time, or you smell something, or you touch something. These are sort of sensory experiences, and so the question that I've been sort of thinking about is, how do we think of the role of those sensory experiences in cognition? And how is it that we reason, based on those experiences? I mean, yeah, I think you're right that experience in the first sense, where it's just what you got, your history, right? That can be a negative for a person, right? But I mean, it seems to me that our understanding of the world, how we take the world to be, the reasonableness of that depends on our sensory experiences in some way.
But Anil, would you say so? Just that example, you're looking out of the window, you're seeing something, you're perceiving something, and you're understanding something. Even if you attempt to wipe the slate clean of all historical noise, your brain is still the perception that you're getting is really a function of the initial conditions given to the brain, and that those initial conditions are driven by history, isn't
That
it?
is right. Yes, that is right. But then, I mean, question: how is it that any judgment that you make on the basis of that experience, how does that have any objective validity? If it is shaped
Right.
by your body, right, your past experiences, how does any judgment have any particular authority? If someone comes along and makes an entirely different judgment, there's a bird flying by, and someone says, there's a couch flying by. So how do we conduct this empirical debate? That's the question. Right? That's the question.
Yeah.
Yeah. One sort of historical view has been that it can't be conducted. That there is no that we can't reason to these things. It just has to be faith. Um, I don't think that's right. I think we can make sense of empirical rationality, where given the experiences, there is only one. There's only one way to take the world. Right? There's no option. It is not arbitrary.
Right. Right. So just talk about that a little bit. So you have another paper, Experience and its Rational Significance, and you say the goals and even the grounds of philosophical account of perception are contested. Fortunately, in the present debate, there's a fair bit of common ground among the participants. So your position, if I understand, Anil, is that experience helps you sort of there's a transitory value. I don't know what the right term is, but it has value, and it actually helps you reason in a rational fashion. Is that right? Am I understanding it
Yeah.
correctly?
If I may just say, that paper that you just mentioned, that's
Yeah.
a debate that I had with three people who have very, very different views of perception: John McDowell and Bill Brewer and Susanna Siegel. So we were debating our different ways of thinking about experience. And
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that all three of them take this standard view, classical view, experience, in the sense that I distinguished, touching, smelling, looking, right? That experience makes certain judgments reasonable. and some certain judgments are even knowledgeable. That's John McDowell's view. What I have suggested is that we can make better sense of empirical reasoning if we think of experience not as making judgments rational, but as making transitions to judgments rational. So, I mean, you might have a crazy view, right? You might have a crazy view. You might, but some people thought that, what happens in perception is that you can see only your own mind and certain mental things. So when you're looking out and when you think you see the bird, you don't really see a bird. You see something mental, a kind of a patch of red, which is mind dependent. Suppose you have the view, right, that all you see are these, they were called sense data. All you see are these mental entities, mind dependent entities, like a green sense datum or a red sense datum. What I wanted to say was that experience doesn't make any judgment rational. It doesn't even make the judgment that bird is flying rational, or that there is a patch of color over there, that rational. What experience does is make the transition rational. That is, you have your antecedent view. How would you take the world to be? It may be a crazy view, right? But given that view, for example, given my present view, my visual experience entitles me to the judgment that there's a TV monitor before me, or that I'm listening to Gil, right? Given that view, a certain judgment is, the transition is rational, not that the judgment is rational, but the transition is rational. So I suggested that we think of the role of experience in cognition. What experience is making rational is not a judgment, but a transition. So it doesn't matter that your view is crazy in the beginning, right? It doesn't matter that view is crazy, but what experience is doing is enriching that view. It's making you, and it enables you to add some new judgments to it, right? So that's the proposal I've been arguing for. I think that we make better sense of our thinking and our reasoning if we think of experience as making transitions rational, not judgments. And what experience does then is you can take a crazy view, you can enrich it, and then it'll get into trouble and you'll correct your view of the world. So I mean, in a crude way, you begin with a flat earth view, you make measurements, and you'll get into trouble. They will not fit. And that leads you to transform your view of the world, right?
So doesn't the brain do that to some extent? And also, if you look at sort of the neurological or neuroscientific basis of the brain, you say when you look out of the window, you get some information, maybe a few pixels of information, and then the brain is making sense of it through a rationalization process. It's using historical data, it's using experience to basically say what that information, that jumbled set of information that I got through the eyes is probably a bird, right? So isn't the brain doing that to some extent?
Yeah, but we really don't know what the brain is doing. But this is a hypothesis, perhaps, right?
Right.
But the question that you and I need to answer is, even we are debating, right? What we are debating, how is it? What is the status of our perceptual judgments in that debate, for example, right? The proposal I'm making concerns not how brains do things, but rather how we should engage with one another as we debate about what the world is like, right? So I mean, how to conduct empirical dialectic? We can debate, right? And this is what goes on in science. There's an empirical dialectic. What are the proper rules governing empirical dialectic? That's the question.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So what you're saying again, I'm trying to understand this. So what you're saying is that let's accept the fact that experience is not perfect. It is giving you a set of conditions, but you can use that, you can take new information, and you can have a transition to a conclusion or a judgment. You can make that transition rational if you understand upfront that the data that you're using could be
Yeah,
faulty.
yeah.
And so it has a lot of implications, right? So even a lot of the societal ills that we see today, or like you mentioned, flat Earth, round Earth type debates, we appear to sit in the corners of a room with conclusions that could improve from both sides. If I understand you correctly, Anil, that could improve from both sides if you consciously make that transition a very rational process.
Yeah, and there is a kind of a skepticism that's around, partly gotten from wrong ways of thinking about the role of experience in cognition, which says anything goes.
Yeah.
I can have my view and you can have your view, and this comes in even with religion. We have various different religious views of the world, and which are taken very seriously, and we're supposed to simply let it be. You can't decide about that. Uh, uh, but that arises in part because of this misconception about the role of experience in cognition, that that everyone can have their own starting point, their own view, and it can't be. It's impossible to settle that. Uh, but I don't think that's right. That I think that a proper account of experience will show us that um, that not all alternatives are equal. It's not up to one person for you to choose your view of the world. There are great obligations on even if, on having a view of the world, right? So yeah.
Right. So what I'm taking away, I know, correct me if I'm wrong. So in education today, we spend a lot of time on scientific process. That is sort of the first category of reasoning that we talked about. There is a lot of confusion there. But when we go out to society, the really valuable reasoning process is a second variety. And there we have some problems because everybody has different initial conditions, different history, different experiences, and the process of reaching a conclusion or a judgment, in general, let me make a statement. Correct me if I'm wrong. Are you saying, in general, that process is not rational, and you have the ability to make it rational, or something different?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that what goes on in science. I mean, science is not like religion. That which
Yeah.
that one has simply faith in it. Um, um, Science is based on reason and experience, and there is no choice about that. It's not like my religion
Right.
is science and your religion is Hinduism or whatever, right? Or Jainism. Um,
Right.
um,
Yeah.
and there is kind of in science too. There is debate, and they're having a pretty vicious debates about how things are.
Mm.
But what I feel is that since when one part of the scientific reasoning is well understood, going from principles to drawing conclusions is a kind of an
Yeah.
engineering type thing.
Right.
But the other part of
Right.
the reasoning process, where we go from this confusing dialectic to principles somehow, that is not well
Mm.
understood.
Mm.
Um, there is good reasoning. There is reasoning there. There is a right reasoning there, and but the character of
Right.
that reasoning is not well understood, and we logicians need to spend
Mm.
more effort trying to understand it. And I made some proposals about how to understand that. Um, yeah. So it's And then this confusion about this empirical kind of reasoning then leads to unfortunate attitudes in society, where, say, coming from the work of Kuhn and other people, there is, it's all up for grabs. There's no rationality there. One can have whatever one's views one wants, right? Say in religion, one can believe whatever one wants, and one is not supposed to question. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right.
But does education have a role
Absolutely.
to play here?
But I think education has to be reformed. Science, for example, is not taught in the way it ought to be taught. The way science is taught is just a bunch of principles that are magically given to one, and some techniques for working with those principles.
Right.
Very often those techniques don't make much sense to the student. But the education has to be on this kind of scientific debate, how scientific debate settles things, the process by which these principles are arrived at. People have to be educated in that, right? But I think before we can do that, we logicians have to figure out some hard questions.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So again, if I understand it correctly, Anil, from a scientific process perspective, we take principles, we make predictions, we measure it. But the more important problem, a more challenging problem, is to take empirical data, or it may not be data, it might be noise even, or it might be a set of experiences, and then reduce that to a principle. That's a much more challenging problem. And it looks like education institutions don't really focus on that. And so the question there would be, so that again, I'm going back to from policy perspective, so how would you, if you were to think about reforming how we educate students, what are the attributes that you would bring in to make it better?
I guess once the logicians have done their homework, there's a debate about this thing. The paper that you mentioned, to make sense of empirical reasoning, you have to have a way of thinking about experience. This kind of experience, visual experience, tactual experience, and that's not settled. There's a debate going on about that. So we need to sort of first sort out the situation amongst ourselves first, right? But I think it's not entirely clear and agreed on right now how to think about experience and how to think about reason. This is not something that's we have not reached a point where we can say, oh yeah, we agree on that. And on deductive logic, there is agreement on a core part, and that's a very powerful part. And that part is so good that it's programmed into computers, right? But we haven't reached there. We aren't there yet with empirical reasoning. But I guess in education, what I would want to stress is this process of scientific debate, how we debate with one another, and how we come to an agreement. In science, we come to an agreement on some very wild things, which are much wilder than political disagreements. I mean, we have come to an agreement about nature of time, for example, right? And this kind of a crazy view that the Earth is round. I mean, this goes against all perception. So if you can come to an agreement there through reasoning, surely we can come to agreement elsewhere. So I mean, I think I would want to stress what I would want to increase the stress on is not sort of using science. I mean, people they are teaching techniques on how to solve various little problems, but rather how to reason and how to debate with one another.
Right.
But that's a case where debate does settle matters and settles very hard matters. And it settles the matters rightly, right? I mean, there's a sense of reasonableness. the conclusion we reach might be actually false, and further experimentation and experience might reveal that. But at least the process is rational, right? So that's what I would want to stress.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting, Anil, that, as technology improves, what we're finding is that, as you say, that the scientific reasoning is programmatic. We can delegate most of science, technology, and engineering, in some sense, mature science, engineering, and technology to computers. It has a positive side to it, which is it should give humans more time to figure out more interesting problems, or think about more interesting problems, which is going in the other direction, which is taking experiences and deducing rules from those experiences and making those rules to be universal in some sense, right? So that's a problem. It's still sort of out there. Perhaps on the positive side, humans may have more time to think about it. We'll take a quick break, Anil. When we come back, we'll talk about your book, Conscious Experience,
right.
A Logical Inquiry.
See you.
Thank you. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So we are back. I know we were talking about experiences and reasoning processes in scientific process. We take well-known principles, we make predictions, we make measurements. That process doesn't appear to have a lot of use of experience. But as you say, the more interesting and more challenging problem is going in the other direction, which is taking one's experiences and then deducing rules from it or making judgments from it. And it's an ongoing debate, as you say. They have obviously implications for education and public policy. I want to now talk about your book, Conscious Experience, A Logical Inquiry. You say the role of experience in cognition is a central and ancient philosophical concern. How theorists ask, can our private experiences guide us to knowledge of a mind-independent reality? So if I understand you correctly, I know you are saying maybe. So what's the central premise of the book?
Well, yeah, there is one purely logical idea that is motivating me. This idea comes from the work I did on the concept of truth with a number of collaborators, including Newell Belknap and Sean Standifer. And that is that we can make sense of logically interdependent things. So I mean, if you say in Euclidean geometry, you begin with certain principles and you deduce things. That's kind of straightforward.
Yeah.
That's the kind of reasoning that we understand very well. But there's another kind of a logical phenomena where things are interdependent, and the kind of thing that you're mentioning, where your past experiences and what I call view shapes your judgments. So your judgments depend upon your experiences and views, and your views depend upon those judgments.
Right. Yeah.
right? So there's interdependence there. Um, one idea that underlies that book is trying to think of empirical cognition while taking this interdependence seriously, not breaking the interdependence. The idea of kind of pure datum of experience that tries to break this interdependence or get a kind of a special judgment or special concepts that don't depend upon your antecedent views, right? And so one thing I do in the book is say, well, let's, that idea gets into a whole lot of problems. It doesn't work. Let's take interdependence seriously. That is, perceptual judgments depend upon views, and views depend upon perceptual judgments, and try to make sense of empirical cognition within this framework.
Right.
So that's one idea that underlies that book.
Yeah. So on that, and also if we take experiences and we make judgments, and those judgments then turn back into our experiences, that's circular. And what we see in the world out there today is that movement from experiences to judgment and back to experiences is self-reinforcing, and you're sort of in a vicious circle that you cannot break out of, right? Is that something? Number one, is that what you think, or you think something different?
Uh, I don't think it is necessarily a vicious circle.
Yeah.
There is a circle, but not all circles are vicious.
Yes.
Some
Yeah.
circles actually do very good work for us. I mean, I'm thinking about logical circles.
Yes.
The traditional logic has ruled all logical circles as illegitimate, improper. And one of the theses that I've argued for, together with other people, is that that's not right. That there are certain kinds of logical circles which are just fine and they are useful and they are good, right? So there is this interdependence of views and judgments. That's undeniable. And there is a kind of a circle there. But that circle is not necessarily vicious. It becomes vicious if one begins with certain kind of bad views, right? Our view of the world has to be such that it is open. It is open to experience. It's open to enrichment and transformation by experience. And if it is that, then even an erroneous view, right, will be or can be shaped by experience into a right view, into a correct view. That's possible, right? So my thesis is that yes, there is this interdependence, there is this circularity, but this circularity is just a fact of life. We can't get around it, for one thing, right? And it doesn't have to be vicious.
Right. So if it is a closed circle, so to speak, then you cannot break out of it. But if you're able to let information in at whatever point in that circle, then you can rationally transition to a better principle, right?
Right. Uh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, by being open to alternative views too, right? By having an empirical debate. I mean, the ideal would be something like this. Say we all begin with very different views, right? Different paths, different, right? The ideal would be this, where we go out, explore the world, and as we enrich our views, right? After with the and the judgment that we might make there themselves may be faulty because of our poor views to begin with. But as we enrich our views and when they become incoherent, try to make them coherent, that we'll come to an agreement. That is, it could be. I mean, this is what I think is the picture of ideal rationality. We begin with arbitrary, or even crazy views about how the world is, but we are sensitive to experience and we make judgments, and our views are malleable and are changeable in light of experience. And through the course of experience, we come to an agreement, right? We
Yeah.
come to this an agreement about the broad layout of the world, right? How the world is. I think that's possible, and I think that is the kind of picture that we ought to have about what makes our views rational. It's kind of openness to is empirical dialectic. It is openness to experience. It is having views that are transformable, which are not rigid. You know, you can have a view which, no matter what the experience, will just confirm itself. Uh,
Right.
uh,
Right.
so, but that's that character of the view. By that very character makes that view a bad view, an irrational view, in my view.
And so if you have a rational process, what you're arguing, and if I understand it, is that the initial conditions don't matter. You may have a set of views that may be incorrect, let's
Yeah,
say. But if you have an open system, it will reach a more logical point over time. Now, I would say also that if you think about that circle being open, I think what we have in society, generally speaking, is that an authority, there's a gatekeeper who allows certain information to go into that circle. Now, that process is not very efficient. I would think that an open circle with no gatekeeper or no filtering of information is probably has a higher chance of getting to optimum.
yeah, I think that's right. I think we have to be very careful about gatekeepers. We've
Yeah,
got to be very careful about censorship of information. That's one way that you know bad regimes and bad worldviews um, survive.
right.
So yes, there has to be as little gatekeeping as possible, right? Uh,
Yeah. And would you say, Anil, again, going back to education, um, I tend to argue that our education system tends to be highly prescriptive. And when you have a highly prescriptive process, you basically that ends up curtailing information and really providing sort of pre-designed chunks of information. And in a world where only innovation really matters, such a process is not going to be that useful from an education perspective.
that seems right to me. I think it's much more important to uh, nurture people's creativity um, um, and curiosity and openness um
Yeah.
than prescribe them to learn certain techniques. Yeah,
So practically speaking, I know, uh, sort of technology schools, universities, STEM education, it does not have, for example, philosophy as a component of education. Um, I went through a very prescriptive education system in India, and when you're 10 or 12 years old, you're basically selecting your profession, and from that point on, you are specializing in something very, very, very deep and narrow. And the US arguably has much higher flexibility, but it's in a spectrum. We have similar situations, right? So are we going toward? I know Scandinavian countries like Finland, for example, have moved away from sort of prescriptive education structure, physics one, physics two, physics three type structure, into something much more designable. Do you think that is a more valuable process?
I don't know. Gil. Partly because I just haven't done research on this topic. Um, uh, I, I I do think that some long, rigorous study of some subject matter is good for one. Um, but the question you raise is a good one, and I don't have a settled view on it. Um, but but I would say the kind of compartmentalization that occurs, right? Where, say, in India, you would have people who would um, study science, right, um, and be very good at it, but at the same time, sort of believe in astrology. You know, um, that kind of combination of kind of compartmentalization. That's not a healthy thing. That means that you've really not understood what's going on, right? Um, you can't study astronomy and come to this kind of a view of what the planets are and the stars, um, and at the same time be have faith in astrology. Right? Uh,
Right.
yeah, so I think this 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 education into how one reasons properly, right?
Mm,
That
mm,
that I
mm.
think that I think is important.
Yeah, in some sense, one could argue, I know that that's the only thing that's important. So, the content of education, the content that you get from education, the half life of that content is going to be declining over time. You don't have to, learn from books that are stagnant because things are going to change. It's going to be much more dynamic and fast. So the only thing that is really useful is the process, not the content.
I think that's right. The content, process is very important. Um, yeah,
Yeah, and this process that you're talking about is, my understanding of this is that, yeah, I mean, we talk about scientific process all the time. That's a deductive process that's well understood. But the real challenging thing for us to really figure out is going the other direction, right? So the question is, how do we do that? And I think reasoning, maybe, some foundational skills need to be there for that to happen, right? Which we don't take away from STEM education, looks like to me.
yeah, yeah. I mean, just Gil, to make one thing plain, I see science as consisting of two kinds of reasoning:
Yeah,
the reasoning from principles and reasoning to principles. And and our education stresses much more reasoning from principles, applying principles, and
right,
the reasoning to principles, that actually is hard and that's not
right.
well understood, and that's under current debate, right? But that's what needs to be stressed. I mean, um, in a practical sense, one can gain skill in that kind of reasoning, and I think that skill needs to be improved and can be improved, right? And our understanding of that reasoning needs to be improved.
So historically, I know, if you look at, ancient cultures and modern world, do you think we have progressed backward in that arena?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that, Gil. Could you?
So these two types of reasoning, right? The reasoning to principles, as you
Yeah.
say. Um, are we worse than maybe early civilizations? Do we have any notion of how people used to be, let's say 5,000 years ago?
Yeah. Well, there is a um, when we, say, when we talk about this reasoning, um,
Yeah.
let's talk about walking. There's a skill of walking. We can walk, right? And ancient man walked just as well as modern man does. Um,
Right.
but there's something else, sort of understanding walking. How is it that we walk, right? Um, to understand walking, that's super hard. And I guess neither ancient man nor us understands it. Perhaps we understand it a little bit better, right? Um,
Yeah.
now, on this kind of the reasoning two principles that I was talking about, reasoning based on experience, ancient man was very skillful and had to be um, to survive, right? So there was the skill; they
Right.
could do it, and we do it. Scientists do it, right? And they can do it without understanding what they are doing, just like they can walk without understanding how they walk, right? Um, and it's the task of the logician to figure out, right, how that reasoning works, just like it's the task of the biomechanist to figure out how we walk. Um, but we do walk, and we do reason rightly in the empirical domain. Um, and ancient man was very good at it, and we are very good at it, and our scientists are very good at it. But ideas about how we reason, well, I mean, I hope we are better off now, but there's been all kinds of strange ideas that have been put. I mean, Plato thought. Plato thought that, that's by senses you can't learn anything about what reality is like. That there is a kind of there's a special power of reason, and he had a kind of a fantastic account of that power of reason. Um, Uh, so I mean, so there've been different kind of views about how to make sense of this reasoning and how to make sense of experience, and some people have strange ideas about how to make sense of it. Um, um, I hope we are better. I mean, I hope the proposal I've made in that book, Conscious Experience, I
Yeah.
hope it helped us understand a little bit um, how this very difficult kind of reasoning works. Uh, and
Right.
there's a to understand that reasoning you have to understand experience, how to think about experience. There has been a
Right.
debate about that for the last 2,500 years, how to think about experience. In the book, I make a proposal about how we should think about it. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to summarize very quickly what how you would kind of understanding experience? What does it look like?
well, um, okay. I guess there are two parts of the proposal, and this is just going to be a
Yeah.
sketch. The one part is what I just mentioned to you before, uh, the bit about that what the rational contribution of experience is not to judgments. Experience doesn't make judgments rational; it makes transitions rational. I've
Mm.
called that idea hypothetical given. Uh, so
Mm.
there's this terminology of given. What experience gives us? So in my view, experience doesn't give us concepts. Experience doesn't give us judgments. What it does give us is this rationality of transitions. And
Mm.
I argue that helps us understand empirical thinking. The other idea that I put forward is this. Um, um, but this may not make all complete sense because I can't. Well, there's a background against which I make this proposal. I suggest that we
Yeah.
think about. There are all kinds of ideas about thinking about experience as representations in the brain or in the mind or whatever, right? I suggest in
Right.
contrast to these ideas that we think of experience. Say, take the experience. So you're looking at a bird, right? There's a bird out there, and you're looking
Mm.
at it. You're having a visual experience of the bird. I suggest that we think of experience as a presentation of reality to consciousness.
Mm.
So when you are experiencing
Mm.
the world, a bit of reality, right, is presented to your consciousness. Um, what that reality is, you don't know about in virtue of that experience. It is not as if, this is where I'm opposing traditional ideas. On the traditional way of thinking about experience, a bit of reality is presented to consciousness, and you come to experience provides you knowledge of that reality, right? What I'm suggesting is that reality is presented to you in experience, but experience doesn't inform you of that reality. And that reality, right? The presentation of that reality, there's another dimension of it, and that is that reality manifests appearances to your consciousness. So the reality doesn't present in itself, right? As you were saying, right? Well, how we experience the experience depends on a lot of things. It depends on the reality. It depends upon environment. It depends on what's going on in your brain. It's going on what's going on in your eyes, right? The whole combination of that, those results in the presentation of reality, right? Manifesting appearances. So a bird might be, suppose birds are real things, right? The bird is a real thing which is presented to you in your visual experience, and that bird manifests in its appearance to your consciousness. So I call this account dual component presentationalism. There's a presentation of the world, and there's an appearance that reality manifests. The experience by itself is not revealing to you what that reality is. That has to be figured out through reasoning, right? And you don't even know the appearances just because they're manifested to you in experience. The old idea was, the subject first comes to know its appearances and then is able to infer from reality from those appearances. I'm suggesting no, you don't even know appearances. That has what reality is has to be figured out through empirical reasoning. So anyway, but that's kind of a crude sketch of the account of experience I put forward. But it'll take a long talk to explain how that works. Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, you're going back to this idea of transition can be rational.
Right.
The transition process can be rational.
If I may just interrupt, Bill, that the appearance, right, is the appearance that renders the transition rational. Yeah, it's in virtue of the appearance. Yeah.
But there's no guarantee that the conclusions and the judgments are rational.
The judgments may not be rational. If your antecedent view is not rational, your judgment may not be rational. So that can happen, right?
Yeah. I want to close, Anil, with another paper, intersubstitutivity principles of the generalization function of truth. You said you offer a defense of one aspect of Paul Horvich's response to the liar paradox, more specifically of his move to preserve classical logic. So what is the liar paradox?
Oh, this is an ancient thing. The concept of truth generates a huge logical problem that we've been thinking about, from ancient times. Eubulides, a Megarian logician, discovered this. So, I mean, the phenomenon is very simple, actually. Suppose we are having a conversation, and I say everything that I've said in the past 2 minutes is false, right? And including this, the 2 minutes include this statement. And suppose everything, as a matter of fact, that I've said in that period is false, except perhaps for this one statement that I made, right? And then, given that situation, you can deduce contradiction, outright. So the liar paradox essentially is that very basic principles governing the concept of truth, logical principles governing the concept of truth, lead to outright contradictions. And the problem with paradox is to understand how our concept of truth works, given this paradox. And it was actually thinking about this paradox that I came to the conclusion that logical interdependence makes sense. that can be made sense of. And this is the work that I did with Nouvel Belknap, and some of this work was independently done by Hans Hertzberger. It had been a view, a kind of common view in logic, that we must think of the concept of truth as fragmented. That there isn't just one concept of truth. So suppose I were to say, that no judgment is both true and untrue, right? It's a kind of logical law. According to this idea of fragmentation, that judgment that I made can't be subsumed under that very judgment. I can't conclude, right, that that judgment can't be both true and untrue. So that was a common view. Some important work was done by Saul Kripke and Robert Martin and Peter Woodruff in 1975, which showed that you do not have to think of the concept of truth as fragmented if you abandon classical logic, if you abandon classical principles. And I was able to show that there's a certain thing called semantically closed languages, which was defined by Alfred Tarski. I was able to show that you can have semantically closed languages that are classical. So you can you do not have to think of truth as fragmented in this way. Myself and Hans Hertzberger and Nouvel Belknap, we constructed a scheme for making sense of the concept of truth in any setting, right, without thinking of it as fragmented.
So I'm thinking, Anil, I don't know if there is a parallel here, in physics, from Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics. When we look at quantum mechanics using classical mechanics, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you don't do that, you get a different set of conclusions, right? Is there any parallel to that?
We were thinking about the root. There was this old idea, as I said to you, that logical interdependence doesn't make sense. And of course, if you rule out logical interdependence, then you can't make sense of the concept, the concept of truth. And what my proposal was, that what Belknap and I showed was that you can make sense of logically interdependent systems of concepts. You can even make sense of circular concepts, and that in fact that we argued that truth is a circular concept, and given the function that it serves in our thinking, it has to be a circular concept. Only a circular concept can serve that function. Now that paper that you just mentioned, Hartree Field had raised an objection to us, saying that a certain kind of intersubstitutability principle was required for truth to serve its function. And if a field were right, then it would follow that you would have to abandon classical logic. And that paper with Sean Standifer shows that actually for truth to serve its function, not the kind of strong intersubstitutability principle that Field was talking about is needed, but something much weaker, right? Something that can be accommodated within this theory of interdependent definitions that we have. So that's what that paper was about.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Anil. Thanks so much for
Oh, thank
spending
you,
time
Gil,
with me.
for this conversation. I greatly enjoyed it.
Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.